Congressman Joe Courtney, welcome to the program.
Hello, David. Glad to be here.
The AUKUS details will soon be announced, but based on what's been reported, can I ask you about this capacity question? Does the US have the capacity to provide 3 and maybe even 5 Virginia-class submarines to Australia?
Well, again, I think it's important to step back and recognize that today, as you know, we're talking, the U.S. industrial base has delivered 21 Virginia-class submarines over the last 2 decades. There'll be 2 more this year, the Rickover and the New Jersey. That will bring it up to 23. And that production cadence, which was slowed down by COVID for some period of time, really, I think, is very much back on track. In addition to the Columbia ballistic submarine program, those subs are 2.5 times the size of a Virginia. And again, that's a must-do program. So our workforce has been growing. We hired 4,000 people in southern New England last year, 5,700 projected for this year. 6 years ago, we saw this bow wave coming in terms of hiring, and we have job training programs for young adults who are doing something else that can quickly get trained up and skilled up as welders, electricians, machinists. We have, secondary school programs for tech kids, tech schools for kids in those same professions. They can walk out of school at age 17 or 18 and walk into a career. So again, I think it's actually going to be a very exciting opportunity for Australia. And again, I know, sitting on the Education and Labor Committee here in Washington, we've had Australian expert witnesses talking about your apprenticeship programs. Again, we don't have to do this tonight. We've got, again, some runway to really stand up these programs. And as I said, I think it's going to be a transformational undertaking, enterprise for working people in Australia.
But coming back to that question of can it be done, there are some doubts there in the United States. We've heard the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Jack Reed, the former Republican Senator James Inhofe, the Rear Admiral Scott Pappano, the senior officer in charge of the US Navy's submarine program, all expressing some concern about the capacity there being pushed to breaking point. Are you confident this can be done?
I am. And again, there was a counter, obviously, communication on a bipartisan basis from the leadership of the Armed Services Committee that pointed out that this is not a zero-sum game. Again, if you look historically at the submarine industrial base in the U.S., which is well over 100 years old, it's grown and contracted given, again, external events, the security environment. If you look at the height of the Cold War, we were building 4 attack submarines at the same time as the ballistic submarine program. Again, right now we realize we're going to have to do some more outsourcing, and you guys were discussing that in terms of Australia possibly being a contributor, whether it's steel fabrication, parts and components. That's happening today down in Alabama with Austal USA, a division of an Australian company I visited just a couple weeks ago. Again, the new steel fabrication plant that they're putting up there, again, to take some of the man hours away from southern New England. That's going to, again, keep these programs on schedule and the cadence moving forward, which the Navy's demand signal requires.
Just on that issue of what Australia will need to contribute here to make this happen, you know these production lines better than most. Would Australia funding a whole new production line be the best approach, adding some funding to the shifts on existing production lines? What should Australia be doing here? What would be the best approach?
So again, on Monday, I think you're going to see a very thoughtful product. These are really serious people. Admiral Caldwell, the head of Naval Reactors, who has been the U.S. principal at the table, understands this stuff, backwards and forwards. And so, again, I think it will probably be done, incrementally in terms of really trying to get people sort of acquainted with the systems and some of the exciting new virtual technology now that's happening in shipyards, as well as robotic welding and ways to really pick up the production rate compared to even what it was 10 years ago. So again, I think everybody understands this is not something that you can just flip a switch and you've got an industrial base to take on really probably one of the most complex types of manufacturing imaginable. You're building a vessel that is operating in an environment that does not support human life. I mean, everything has to be perfect. But as I said, we've got some really good programs. And by the way, I visited the British shipyard up in Barrow and seen the great work that they're doing with the Astute class and the Dreadnought class. So that's the exciting thing about this partner. I mean, we've got 3 countries where the trust level is as strong and deep as possible. Countries with already pre-existing industrial bases, so there's a lot to work off of. And I would just note that even looking at the Collins class submarines, again, there was U.S. technology on board those submarines for weapons systems. Again, I've visited HMS Sterling and saw it myself. So this is not brand new stuff in terms of collaborating. The U.S.-UK collaboration is, if anything, even more widespread and well precedent, deep precedent in terms of succeeding.
Just to be clear, though, Australia will have to contribute to production capacity in the US in some way. I think all 3 countries, and we're all going to, it's going to be a mixture. I mean, everybody's going to be sort of contributing to each other's needs. And certainly to the extent that, again, getting the Australian workforce sort of up and running, the fact that there is not an existing AUKUS submarine program right away in the late 20s or mid 20s, I mean, then obviously contributing to the Virginia program is just a logical way to increase proficiency for welders and electricians and all the skilled jobs that take that repetition and take that cadence to really get up to the high level of quality. And doing that, doing that through a new production line or just adding extra shifts on the shipyard in your district, Connecticut?
There's no question we're building out capacity. We just cut a ribbon on a new production facility that cost $700 million to build, and there's more facility that's going up. Again, if you look at World War II, what Groton looked like in terms of the number of production plants that were there. Again, this is not something new in terms of expanding facility.
But you'll need Australian help. You'll need Australian help.
It is now. No question about it, and we welcome it, and I think it'll benefit Australia in terms of really getting a workforce that's going to have the skill set to build its own subs, and that's what I think is really what everyone wants to see happen. We want this program to succeed.
Would it be more likely Australia gets existing Virginia-class submarines or brand new ones?
When it comes out, you'll see.
Okay.
Like I said, there's going to be, I think, what I will tell you is what you will get is of the highest quality. And I say that sincerely. Again, the shelf life of a Virginia-class submarine is 33 years. And it has life of boat nuclear reactor. It doesn't require refueling. No one's going to be, foisting off clunkers on good friends and allies. I mean, this is about really having, the type of stealth and the type of reach which the strategic environment requires. I mean, China's missile force is really, in my opinion, the real reason that's driving this decision, because surface ships right now are so vulnerable. And we saw it in Ukraine, where 2 relatively crude short-range missiles took down the flagship of the Russian Navy. Again, the surface is really a much more risky place, and unfortunately, a diesel-electric, which was the prior plan, has to exist and operate on the surface.
What's the risk of a future U.S. administration, potentially even a second Trump administration, considering that all of this is too risky? We want to put America first. We like Australia, but we're putting America first. What's the risk of that?
Well, I would tell you this. I mean, talking to my Republican colleagues, working with the Australian Friends of Australian Caucus and the AUKUS working group, I mean, there is very strong support within the Congress on a bipartisan basis for this effort. I really do want to foot stomp, though, the discussion about who's in charge and who makes the decisions. Again, there is already existing collaboration between the Australian submarine force and the U.S. submarine force. I've seen it personally. and no one questions about who's the decision maker in terms of how your subs operate. There will be some moments, I'm sure, when Australian sailors will be on board Virginia-class submarines, but that's going to be for training purposes. That's not for operational missions in terms of where they're basically saluting U.S. officers. And again, this is going on today with the U.K. and U.S. submarine forces. They have visiting sailors, visiting officers, but it's really for instructional training purposes.
I think the concern, though, is more about the concern is more about when Australia purchases these US submarines and the likelihood they're going to be jointly crewed with Americans. Will those American personnel answer to an Australian commander if there is a disagreement?
Well, again, I think the notion that there's going to be joint crewing is really overhyped, honestly.
You don't think there will be?
Again, I said there clearly has to... I don't. I think that everyone understands we need to train up the Australian sailors and officers in terms of nuclear propulsion, which is all we're talking about here, not nuclear weapons, and that when the time comes for the deed, the title to be handed to the government of Australia of a vessel, that again it's going to be totally with the full understanding that it's going to be under Australian control.
Even nuclear technicians won't be required from the United States?
Again, the training schools in the U.S. for sailors, and again, one of them is in my district, you're talking about kids who come in with zero qualifications. When they leave these training programs, they are qualified. And the same is true of the officers. And by the way, that's already started to happen in terms of the training. I mean, that can't wait. We got to move that out as soon as possible. But no one wants to be in a situation where there's any conflict of who's in charge or who's giving orders or who's taking orders. We understand that's precious for every nation to be able to control and make their own decisions.
A final one, Congressman. You mentioned the bipartisanship that you've encountered there in Congress for this whole deal. What about the export controls in the US there that do need to change to allow this technology sharing, not just on the nuclear submarines, but other technology as well under AUKUS? Just explain to us what the obstacles there are and how challenging this will be to resolve.
Sure. So we have an Arms Export Control Act, which is very tight in this country in terms of export of defense components and pieces. I mean, it's just endless in terms of its scope. And the goal here is to really try and create a carve-out for AUKUS, which avoids, again, these becoming barriers in terms of really getting the technology transfer that's required. We have such a carve-out for Canada today. Again, the defense sectors are much more free-flowing and seamless because of the fact that we made that adjustment, and that's going to be a focus. Again, the clock is ticking here in our congressional session. It's a little tricky right now in terms of the overall politics of this chamber, but everybody understands that that's something that definitely needs to be focused on. We're looking at the Defense Production Act amendment, which I've already introduced or submitted requests for modification to help AUKUS in that arena, and so that is clearly a must-do item for Congress. And as I said, I think based on the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, a lot of the discussion, I think Monday is going to be a really great opportunity to elevate the importance of all three countries working together, and that includes the U.S. Congress. So I feel good about the fact that as difficult and as polarized as Washington is right now, that this is an issue that's going to get really serious attention and finally, enactment.
Congressman Joe Courtney, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Great. Thanks, David.